The dawn broke quietly over the misty valley, a fragile light creeping through the cracks of clouds that still clung to the mountaintops like torn veils, and in that soft glow stood a tiny figure, a little girl no older than 10, her clothes ragged, patched and too large for her frail frame, her bare feet hardened by the rocky soil she called home, her eyes carrying a depth of sorrow beyond her years, for she had grown up with little more than hunger and silence as companions, abandoned by fortune and left with a life that seemed destined for invisibility, and yet, inside her heart flickered something strangely resilient, a spark of kindness and courage that poverty could not crush, for she believed, in her innocent way, that even the weakest hands could lift another if they tried. Her name was Alara, and though her neighbors in the village often looked past her as though she were nothing more than a shadow wandering near the huts, she carried a strength that no one saw, and it was this unseen strength that fate would soon call upon. The morning was harsh, the wind sharp with the smell of smoke from distant cooking fires, the earth damp from last night's rain, and Alara, clutching her woven basket with only a few wild berries she had gathered, trudged toward the forest's edge to search for mushrooms that she might trade for a scrap of bread at the market, her stomach growling as she moved, her steps quiet against the leaves. As she walked deeper into the woods, where the shafts of sunlight filtered through branches like golden spears, she heard a sound that made her pause. A soft cry, weak and broken, like the sound of an injured bird. Curious and cautious, she pushed aside the tall grass and followed the faint whimper until she came upon a sight that froze her where she stood. Beneath a crooked oak, sitting with his leg bent at an unnatural angle, was a boy, no older than herself, his skin darkened by the sun, his clothes of rough hide marking him as a child of the native tribes that the villagers feared and whispered about, calling them wild and dangerous, strangers to trust. His face was twisted with pain, and tears streaked the dirt across his cheeks, his small hands gripping a stick as though it might hold him together, and Alara, though taught by her people to avoid such encounters, felt only a rush of pity, for suffering looked the same in every face, no matter where it came from. She crept closer, her heart pounding, her mind torn between fear and compassion, and whispered, "Are you hurt?" The boy looked up, startled, his dark eyes flashing with both fear and defiance, as if ready to push her away, but then the pain in his leg overcame him and he let out a groan, collapsing back against the tree. Alara dropped her basket and hurried to his side, ignoring the warnings of her elders that these tribes were enemies, remembering only that this was a child in pain. She touched his swollen ankle gently, wincing at the heat radiating from it, and though she had no medicine, no bandages, she tore a strip from her own worn dress and bound his leg as best as she could, whispering reassurances that everything would be all right, though she herself did not know if it was true. The boy's breathing slowed, his eyes softened, and for the first time he looked at her not as a stranger, but as someone who cared, and in that silent exchange a bond was forged that neither of them understood fully, but one that fate had written long before this morning. Alara stayed with him, fed him the few berries she had gathered, and searched the forest floor for herbs her late mother had once shown her, herbs that soothed pain and brought down swelling, and with trembling hands she chewed them into a paste and applied it to his injury, praying it might help. Hours passed, the sun climbed higher, and though hunger gnawed at her, she remained, keeping watch, shielding him from the curious eyes of passers-by, knowing that if the wrong villager found them together, accusations would rise, for her people and his had lived side by side with suspicion for generations. At last, when the boy could speak, he whispered his name, Kalen. His voice was hoarse, yet there was strength in it, a strength born of mountains and rivers, and he thanked her in his tongue, a word strange yet beautiful to her ears, and though she did not understand fully, she felt the meaning in his tone. By dusk, she helped him limp to the edge of the forest, where he told her he would find his way back to his people, and before he left, he placed his small hand over his heart, bowing slightly, a gesture of gratitude that seemed sacred, and then he disappeared into the shadows, leaving Alara alone with the faint hope that her kindness had mattered. She thought it was over, just a moment in the endless tide of her poor days, an act done quietly, without reward or recognition, but life has a way of echoing the smallest choices into thunderous consequences. That night, Alara lay in her straw bed in her tiny hut, her body aching from hunger, yet her heart strangely light, warmed by the memory of Kalen's grateful eyes, and she drifted to sleep unaware that her world was about to change. The next morning came with a strange tension in the air, a quiet that hung heavier than usual, and when she stepped outside, clutching her basket once more, she froze at the sight before her, At the edge of the village, their figures rising like shadows against the sun, stood not one, not two, but 40 warriors, tall and fierce, their bodies painted with tribal marks, their eyes sharp as eagles, their spears gleaming, their movements precise as if they were one breathing force, and they were coming straight toward her hut. The villagers gasped, scattering, slamming doors, hiding their children, for never had so many warriors entered the village at once without cause, and the air was thick with fear. Alara's heart pounded, her knees weak, for she thought they had come to punish her for helping Kaelin, that her act of compassion had doomed her, and she stood frozen as the ground trembled under their march. Yet as the warriors approached, their faces were not twisted with rage but with something deeper, unreadable, and they stopped at her door, 40 strong, silent and formidable, their leader stepping forward, his voice deep and commanding as he spoke words she could not understand, yet his hand motioned toward her with reverence, not hostility. The villagers peered from their hiding places, whispering, trembling, wondering why a poor little girl, the one they had ignored all her life, was now the focus of a powerful tribe's attention. Alara, trembling, could only clutch her chest and stare, caught between terror and wonder, as the warriors stood at her threshold like guardians of a destiny she had not chosen, but one that was now undeniably hers. And so began a story greater than she could ever imagine, a story of courage, trust, and the power of a single act of kindness that would ripple far beyond her tiny life, shaking the walls of prejudice and fear, and binding two worlds together in ways no one thought possible. For what she did in the silence of the forest had not gone unnoticed, and those who had been watching would make sure she understood just how much her small kindness mattered. If this story touched you, dear listener, remember that small acts of kindness can change entire worlds. So stay with us for the next chapter, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories that inspire the heart. The silence that fell after the 40 warriors gathered at Alara's door was heavier than thunder, and though her small body trembled, her spirit whispered that she must not cower, for something far greater than fear was unfolding, something that would decide not just her fate but perhaps the fate of both the villagers and the tribe beyond the forest. The leader of the warriors, towering above the others with braided hair adorned by eagle feathers and a necklace carved of bone, looked upon her with an intensity that burned through her very skin, yet when he spoke his tone carried no anger, only gravity, as though he were addressing not a child but someone of profound importance. The villagers whispered among themselves, their voices dripping with suspicion, "Why her? What has she done? Why are they here?" But none dared step forward, for the sight of so many armed men was enough to silence even the boldest. Alara's heart beat like a drum in her chest, but she remembered Kaelin's soft eyes when she had helped him, the trust that had shone through pain, and so she lifted her chin, small but unyielding, and whispered with a trembling voice, "I only helped a boy who was hurt." The leader studied her, and then, with a gesture, commanded 2 warriors to step aside, revealing Kaelin himself, standing on a crutch, his leg bound in leaves and herbs, his face brighter and stronger than when she had last seen him. His eyes lit up at the sight of her, and he spoke words in his native tongue, his voice filled with pride, and though she could not understand, she felt the gratitude woven through every syllable. The leader then bowed his head slightly to her, a gesture that shocked the villagers, for never before had such fierce men bowed to anyone outside their people, much less a child of poverty. It became clear to Alara that her act of kindness had reached beyond Kaelin's pain. It had touched the very heart of the tribe, for they had learned what she had done, how she had cared for one of their own when no one else would, and to them, that was no small matter, it was sacred. The warriors now stood not as enemies but as protectors, as if awaiting her command, and the villagers, seeing this, began to murmur with unease, for they had dismissed her as nothing all her life, and yet here she was, honored by those they feared most. The chief, whose name she later learned was Eric, spoke in broken words of her language, enough for her to understand. "Small girl, big heart. You healed Kaelin. You saved tribe's son. We honor." His words echoed in the stunned silence of the village square, and Alara, still trembling, realized that she had not only saved Kaelin but had unknowingly saved a bond between 2 worlds. For Kaelin was no ordinary boy, he was the son of the chief, heir to the warriors, and her act had rippled like fire through the tribe, igniting respect and duty that demanded they come to her door, not to harm but to protect. In that moment, the villagers saw what they had overlooked, that kindness does not measure wealth or strength but the courage to act when no one else will. Yet, even as awe grew in some, envy grew in others, for the village elder, a stern man who had long taught that the tribes were enemies, glared at Alara with suspicion, whispering that perhaps she had betrayed them, that her closeness to the warriors was dangerous. Fear began to creep into the hearts of many, and soon whispers of distrust spread like wildfire. Some wanted her gone, others wanted her shielded, and the tension between the two sides simmered. Alara, though small and afraid, stood firm, for she felt Kalen's eyes on her, trusting her, believing in her, and she could not let that trust crumble. The warriors, sensing the unrest, surrounded her hut, forming a silent wall of protection, their presence both intimidating and comforting, and for the first time in her life, Alara felt that she was not alone. Days passed, and with them grew an uneasy truce. The warriors stayed in the village, refusing to leave her side, while the villagers struggled to reconcile their fear with the reality that these supposed enemies had shown no violence, only honor. Alara spent her days speaking with Kalen, learning fragments of his language, sharing laughter despite the barriers between them, and in those moments she realized how similar they truly were, two children of different worlds, bound by pain, compassion, and a quiet dream of peace. Slowly, others began to see it too. Mothers who saw Kalen's smile softened, children who once hid came out to play, and even the harshest skeptics began to question whether the hatred they had carried for generations was truly justified. But peace is never born without trial, and soon a storm rose that would test the fragile bond Alara had woven. One night, under the cloak of darkness, a group of men from the village, led by the bitter elder, plotted to drive the warriors out, fearing that their presence meant eventual domination. They crept toward the camp with torches, whispering of fire and vengeance, but before they could strike, Alara, awake and restless, saw the flicker of flames and rushed to intercept them. Standing before the mob, her tiny figure illuminated by torchlight, she cried out with a voice stronger than she knew she had, begging them to stop, reminding them of what she had seen in Kalen's eyes, of the gratitude in the warriors' silence, of the chance for peace that was now before them. The men hesitated, torn between anger and the undeniable truth that this child, whom they had dismissed as worthless, now stood as the only bridge between destruction and harmony. Her words faltered, but in that moment Kalen appeared at her side, limping yet resolute, and though he spoke in his tongue, his meaning was clear. He placed his hand upon her shoulder and then lifted it to the sky, a gesture of unity that resonated even without translation. The mob, shaken, lowered their torches, and for the first time in generations, the village chose not hatred but hope. From that night on, the warriors and villagers began to share small moments of trust, trading food, teaching each other skills, even sharing songs by the fire, and at the center of it all was Alara, the poor little girl who had once been invisible but was now the thread binding two worlds. Months passed, and though challenges remained, the bond held strong, and Alara grew into a symbol of courage, her story whispered not just in the village but in the forests beyond, a reminder that even the smallest hand can change the course of nations. Yet for Alara herself, the greatest reward was not the honor of warriors or the respect of villagers, it was the knowledge that her mother's teachings, the little fragments of kindness she had clung to, had blossomed into something greater than she ever imagined. And as she stood one evening at the edge of the forest, Kalen beside her, watching the sun set in a blaze of gold and crimson, she realized that though she had begun as a poor tiny girl forgotten by the world, she had become the spark of something eternal, something that would echo long after she was gone. And so, dear listener, let this story remind you that no act of kindness is ever too small, no heart too poor to change the world, and if you found hope in Alara's courage, then stay with us for more stories that inspire, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, for your support keeps alive the flame of tales that touch the heart.